Welcome to another episode of MP Access Podcast, everyone. I'm David Wharton, the Editor-in-Chief of Mortgage Point and the Five Star Institute. Today we have another wonderful guest speaking to us who we've talked to a few times in the past for the magazine at some of our events. Today we're speaking with Edward J. Pinto, who is the Resident Fellow and Director of the American Enterprise Institute Housing Center. Welcome to the show, Edward.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to participate.
So, Edward, you've almost certainly heard of his name. He has served at Fannie Mae back in the 1980s as Executive Vice President and Chief Credit Officer, and since then has been a well-respected source and subject matter expert on housing finance policy and federal housing policy over the years. You've seen him on numerous shows throughout the years, and he's spoken to us a couple of times. And we're going to speak today about just some of the trends and things that are happening out there in the world. So, Edward, to start with, I know you recently released an update on the AEI State Housing Supply Legislative Update, which covers various reforms that are happening across the different states. Could you kind of give us a high-level look at what trends you're seeing as far as policies that are actually effectively boosting housing production out there, and what else needs to be done that maybe isn't happening?
So, David, perhaps a little background first. In the United States, the responsibility for land use controls lies with the states, and that devolves from the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which our Constitution gives defined powers to the federal government, gives some defined powers to state governments, and everything else resides under the 10th Amendment to the states or the people. The federal government does not have a general assignment of power. A general assignment of power includes what are known as the police power, the power to regulate things like land use. We're not talking about police as in cops and robbers. We're just talking about the power to regulate land use. Therefore, the states have that power. They started undertaking it in large measure back in 1922, ironically at the behest of the federal government, not by any statute, but literally the bully pulpit from the Department of Commerce, which came up with a model zoning code. That model zoning code basically said, oh, you want to have zones and you want discrete zones and you don't want to mix uses in zones. And the ideal zone for residential is single family detached residential. And prior to that point in time, and if you go look at any neighborhood that was built in the 20s or earlier, you'll generally find that it's a mix of single family detached, some townhomes, some row houses, some small apartment buildings, some commercial doctor's offices, you name it, even ADUs were commonplace in the United States. That all largely ended once this new regime that the federal government suggested very strongly and was adopted at the state level and then pushed down to the local level. So we've been living with it for over 100 years. And as a result, that structure by design was to raise home prices. This sounds crazy, but they wanted to make housing more expensive. Why did they want to make housing more expensive? Well, a very simple reason. The Supreme Court in 1916 had said you could not use zoning for race-based purposes. There was a desire to segregate based on race. If they couldn't segregate based on race, they figured they could segregate based on economic outcome, the ability to afford a home. So if they made the homes more expensive, individuals of certain races wouldn't be able to afford them, and also of certain national origins wouldn't be able to afford them. That was the underlying premise. And we're still living with the result that the goal was to increase the cost of housing. That was done through things like larger lots, lot setbacks, home sizes, minimum lot sizes were became a big part of this. So to your question, we've done a lot of research over the last 7 or 8 years, where we've done over 30 case studies. And what we have found from the case studies is that the three most important things, just like in real estate, it's location, location, location. Three most important things in housing affordability are small lot, small lot, small lot. Why is it small lot, small lot, small lot? Well, smaller lots take less land. And it turns out that in the last 30, 40 years, what's been the biggest contributor to the run up in home prices? Land cost. Why? Because zoning and land use requirements make land that you can develop and redevelop scarce and expensive. That has been the biggest driver of home price costs and unaffordability. What's the second biggest driver? Well, the size of the home and the quality of the appurtenances to the home, the fixtures and the quartz granite tops, etc. Well, homes have gotten a lot larger. Back in the 1950s, they were 12, 1,300 square feet. They peaked at around 24, 2,500 square feet back in the probably aught years, in the early 2010s. They came down. Now they're down a couple hundred square feet, but they're still well over 2,000 square feet. So the second smaller lot says if you have a small lot, you're going to build a smaller house on a smaller lot. It's still going to be family size, probably 3 bedrooms, but it won't be as large as the house on the bigger lot. And the construction is probably going to cost a bit less. Why? Because it's not going to be as high end. It won't have maybe the granite countertops. It might have not have that extra half bathroom. And so it's going to, or extra garage space. So it's going to cost less. The third reason is you can build townhomes. Well, townhomes are a sweet spot in terms of starter home affordability. They take even less land, about 2,000 square foot per acre on average, versus 8,000 square feet for the typical single family detached built in the United States, so about a quarter of the land. They're going to be, instead of 2,300 square feet, they might be 1,600 square feet. And they're simpler to build. You have fewer windows, fewer exterior walls. And very importantly, they can be built under the residential building code. The residential building code, which is adopted state by state and locality by locality, pretty much standard in a standard format, basically says the residential building code applies to 1 unit, 2 unit, and townhomes. Does not apply to 3 units, does not apply to 4 units or anything above 3 units. Therefore, if you build anything other than a 1, 2, or townhome, you're going to pay, starting at the 3 unit, about 15% more per square foot. And then it goes up from there as you add elevators and more complexity, high-rise buildings. And so the sweet spot is the single family one, the duplex, and a townhome, which can have 4, 6, 8, 10 townhomes in a row. It all counts as single family residential. So what's happening today is starting a few years ago in Maine, Vermont, Montana, efforts in Washington, Oregon, some efforts in California, but nothing's easy in California, to legalize back what used to be legal back in the 1920s, which was you could have housing that was of a similar size and scale as to single family homes in the neighborhood, even though they might have 2 units or 3 units or 4 units, or they might be townhomes or ADUs for that matter. And so that started in those states, but Texas really broke through last year in 2025 when they passed SB 15, which basically said in the 18 or so largest cities in the state, you can't have a lot size requirement greater than 3,000 square feet in new residential subdivisions, which is where most new homes get built.
Right.
Think of greenfield subdivisions. And that passed and was signed by the governor. That has led to a focus on, that was done through a grassroots effort in Texas, Texans for Reasonable Solutions. That led to an effort in a lot of other states in 2026. We tracked in the report that you alluded to 19 states that have bills under consideration that would implement one of 3 options that we identified in playbooks that we published in mid 2025 in conjunction with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And those 3 options are new residential construction, smaller lot flexibility in new residential subdivisions. Two, flexibilities on both structure and lot size in existing subdivisions. Think of it as infill. And three, the flexibility to build residential in commercial and light industrial and mixed use zoning areas that don't allow residential. Those three options open up huge amounts of potential supply and lower costs in the form of starter homes for the nation. And as I said, we found 19 states as of just a week or so ago that had legislation that had been introduced that would implement one or more of those three options.
I know when we spoke, I think last summer was the last time we talked, but I know one of the big sort of buzzwords you were walking me through was the concept of light touch density. Could you unpack that a little bit for people who aren't familiar with that term and how that differs from other inclusionary housing approaches?
So back to what happened in the 1920s, it would have been normal to have various types of density in terms of housing. You could have had lot sizes of 4,000, 8,000, 12,000 square feet. You could have had homes on all those varying sizes. The first house my wife and I moved into in 1975 was built in 1927, and it was a 4,800 square foot lot, 40 by 120. We thought the yard was huge. And the house had 3 bedrooms at 1,400 square feet. We thought the house was, a fantastic house. Again, that would be a starter home today, but that is basically illegal to build in most areas of the country. You can't build on a 4,800 square foot house that has 1,400 square feet. And so one of the terms that was developed was called the missing middle, that because of the way the zoning got introduced, it created these single family detached zones, and then everything else fit into another zone called multifamily. So things that were like single family, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, triple deckers, as they were called in New England, those are all thrown into the multifamily category. Well, once you establish the multifamily zoning category, if you were a developer or a builder, you would tend to build to the highest and best use in that zoning category. So what got skipped over was the missing middle. You didn't build the 2s and the 3s and the 4s and the townhomes. You built the apartment buildings. And so we've documented how that part of the market largely disappeared, and it had been quite prevalent in places like New England and all across the country. Mm-hmm. There are other terms for it, gentle density, things like that. I coined the term light touch density because some of the graphics being used in the missing middle had it looking like you were still replacing with a lot of density. And that's been an issue. And so I came up with this term light touch density. And so we use that term, and it's still used quite a bit. But the term that has actually sort of taken over for it has been starter home and flexibility. And that's something that, as I said, there are a number of bills. Florida has one that's entitled the Starter Home Act. And it basically says that a municipality can't set a minimum lot size in either a new residential subdivision or in existing subdivisions of greater than 1,200 square feet. And which would allow townhomes to be built generally in most everywhere. And so the term starter home, which is really what we're missing, and the term flexibility, which is really what we're talking about. Why shouldn't you have the flexibility to build on lots of 4,000 versus 8,000 versus 6,000? And what our research has shown is that given the choice, and this is a sort of a common misconception, there is a misconception that builders build large houses because they make more money with a large house. That is absolutely not true. Think of Henry Ford. People were building expensive cars when Henry Ford introduced the Model T. He figured he's going to build the car for the masses. He used mass production techniques to build for what you could call the missing middle. There was no middle car. You only had
Right.
expensive cars. And he realized that he could sell a lot more cars selling to the masses at a lower price, and he'd make a lot more money than he would make selling expensive cars.
Hmm.
And the same thing happens with housing. If you think of a lot of 8,000 square feet and you put $1 million house on it, and you'd have about 5 homes per acre. Forget the streets for the moment, just based on lot size. So you build 5 of those on 8,000 square foot lots at $1 million, that's $5 million. Well, what else could you do with that 8,000 square foot lot? You could build easily 4 townhomes, and those
Hmm.
4 townhomes could sell for $350,000. Well, that's 1.4 million, and 1.4 million times the what did I say? Five houses instead of 5 million. You're now at 7 million. You're going to make more money at $7 million than you are at 5 million. And our research demonstrates that if given the choice, meaning it's legal, that
Right.
builders will build on smaller lots because it's more economically viable to do that. And we do that through a series of, on this side of the street, it's legal to build duplexes. On the other side of the street, it's not. What gets built on the one side of the street? Duplexes. What gets built on the other side? Single family detached. The everything, the cost of lumber, the labor, everything else is the same. Interest rates, lending. What's different is the law, what is
Yeah.
allowed under the law. And so we've done, as I said, 30 over 30 case studies that have shown that. So light touch density basically says let's have the flexibility to allow the property owner to build. And the other thing about light touch density, it happens slowly. Of course, if you're building a new subdivision, it's going to happen all at once, but a new subdivision doesn't have any NIMBYs, not in my backyard yet. But for the
Sure.
not in my backyard types, um, the light touch density is very slow moving. We've done studies that show that if you have 100 homes, that it's economically viable to tear them down and replace them. That replacement process is about 1% a year. It doesn't happen very fast. Why? Well, first of all, the house has to come on the market. And then somebody has to decide to not just live in it as it is, because these are perfectly fine houses. They're just not the highest and best use of the land. But most buyers who buy a house are just looking at what's there.
Right.
And usually what happens is you need high land prices. This goes back to why housing has gotten so inexpensive. It's because of the high land prices. Well, it's not feasible to tear down a perfectly good house where the house is worth 150,000 and the land is worth 50,000. That's called a land ratio of 25%. You're generally not going to tear down the $150,000 structure to build on a $50,000 lot. Now let's
Right.
reverse the numbers. Now let's assume it's a 50,000, well, double it to a $100,000 house on a $500,000 property that sells for 500,000. Now you have a $400,000 land price and a $100,000 structure. Wait a minute, that land cost of 400,000 is too much for a $100,000 structure. It might have been fine when it was built
Yeah.
70 years ago, but it's no longer the highest and best use. You can tear down that structure and replace it with one that costs, say, $800,000. And now you have about a $1.3 million house that would sell, otherwise known as a McMansion. But the land value is now back down to roughly $500,000.
Right.
And so that's the way the process works. And light touch density allows that process to occur, sort of naturally through this flexibility.
One of the proposals that had been put forward earlier this year, or maybe late last year, was the president had suggested unlocking federal land for housing purposes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What are the opportunities? What are the pitfalls of that idea? What are the pros and cons?
So let's start with the fact that the Bureau of Land Management, as it's called, used to be called the Bureau of Land Sales. And
Hmm.
once you have a bureaucrat and you change the name from land sales to land management, their focus is going to be on managing land. Even though the statute that established the parameters of the Bureau of Land Management specifically says one of the two purposes is to sell land, and there's a process of how you do it to sell land for the purpose of economic development. And we just did a study on new factories in the United States that are being built, 73 of them. And there's a saying in economic development that economic development needs housing. Why? Because that's where jobs go to sleep. And if you don't think about the housing part of the factory or economic development, you're not going to have places for people to sleep. And so in large areas out west, the federal government owns huge swaths left over from westward expansion of the western part of the country. It's almost all, it's the land's all in the west,
Right.
far west. And it totals just in the lower 48 about 270,000 square miles. That's the size of Texas.
Wow.
Now, Texas actually has zero Bureau of Land Management land, ironically. New Mexico has a fair amount right next to it, but Texas has zero. But it's the size of Texas. We've suggested that if you were to sell a modest amount, we're talking about 1/10 of 1%, 270 square miles. That is its highest and best use for these 270 square miles is residential development. Largely going to be single family and townhome because of where the land's located. But you could build housing for a fair, number of people. You could build hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homes on 270 square miles. And particularly if those homes were on lots of 4,000 square feet, townhomes on 2,000 square feet, you could build a lot of starter homes, which are in great demand and need out west. And so that's the idea. None of this land is Yogi Bear, whatever, Yellowstone Park. It has nothing to do with the national parks. It has nothing to do with the national forests. It has nothing to do with national monuments. Because the Bureau of Land Management has nothing to do with those things. Those are the Department of Forestry and the National Park Service. The Bureau of Land Management manages undesignated land that was unused for other stuff. Some of it's used for ranching. But again, what we're talking about here is very modest amounts of land that is very close, adjacent to or very close to development. And that would help reduce the pressures out west, where ironically, the western third of the country is the least affordable. If you divide the country into three sections, north, south, the western third of the country is the least affordable.
I know another thing you guys have worked on is the topic of appraisal gaps and valuations. Coming out of that work, how would you recommend policymakers balance appraisal reform against protecting homeowners from overvaluation risk in some of those volatile markets?
Well, that's a big question. We could probably spend an hour just on that.
That's all right. We got a little bit longer.
The reality is a lot of consumer groups want to have it both ways. In the run up to the great financial crisis, they were decrying the fact that appraisals were coming in too high, and that somehow cheated the borrowers because they were overpaying. In the 2020s, the cry was the appraisers were coming in low and house prices were worth more than they were appraising at, or there was some race-based gap. And so, which is it? Are appraisers overappraising or are they underappraising? You can't have it both ways, but we've heard it both ways. So I don't know that we have a particular appraisal, issue in this country relative to new home sales. It's a relatively robust, competitive market. It's an auction market. What we do find is that home buyers with less experience, first-time home buyers, generally pay somewhat more than home buyers with more experience. Well, that probably works for cars also, if you have more experience. And sometimes it just comes with experience. And can the government fix all of these things that somewhat happen naturally? We have found no real evidence of there being race-based differences in the appraisals, what we have found is that there are socioeconomic status differences, namely income, education, things of that nature, but they apply equally to white buyers and minority buyers. We just haven't found the other evidence. And we've done a lot of work in this area, and one of the tests that we use to ascertain whether there is any of this discrimination on a broad scale, systemic discrimination. Any individual case is certainly, bad, but we're talking about systemic instances where it just permeates the entire field of appraising. We have not found anything remotely like that. And so the test we use is, well, okay, let's do our test based on race, minority versus non-minority, and we don't see the kinds of things that get alleged. But then we run the test a second time. We say, let's take race out of it. Let's just look at the non-minority or the white population. And we look at the variance there, and we find the same amount of variance among buyers there as we saw among the others. And we say, well, wait a minute, that's due to socioeconomic status. It's due to income levels and education levels, but it's not due to race. And so that's, again, the way that we demonstrate that these instances or claims are not well-founded. There was a very well-known study done by a think tank that alleged that there was I think a 17 or 18% difference in home prices in census tracts that were minority versus census tracts that were white. And we did two things in sort of studying that. First, before we did it, we replicated it completely. We were able to replicate their findings based on how they did it. I forget exactly. I think they had 21 controls that they used. And they said, we've now identified all 21 things that can account for any difference in price due to either neighborhood or structure. And whatever's left has to be due to discrimination, is fundamentally what they said. And they found this 18% whatever. And we said, okay, well, what if we added, let's say it was 21 controls. What if we added a 22nd control? And we added one that basically had to do with whether there was one or two borrowers on the loan. Well, they had one of their 21 had to do with what's the percentage of single mothers with children under 18 in the census tract? That was one of their 21 that they controlled for. Well, the one we had was pretty close to that. It was similar, but it actually had to do with A, mortgages, which is what the study had to do with, and B, the data were coming from loan files which had been checked. Namely, it's a fact, was there one or two borrowers on the loan? And that was a proxy for, in effect, whether you had two wage earners or one wage earner or two people in the household that were on the loan versus one. And when we put that in, the 18% difference almost disappeared and was no longer statistically significant. We did a second addition. We added a second item in lieu of that first item. We tried a second one. The second one basically said, we're going to use the Equifax risk factor, which is what is the credit score of the census tract, and we're going to use that as a factor, as a control. When we did that, the 18% disappeared entirely, which again told us that it was socioeconomic, not race. Then we did that other test that I mentioned, which said, okay, we ran somewhat the same thing, but we took race out of it entirely. We only looked at census tracts that had no, virtually rounded to zero, minorities. And then we said, what's the variance in prices once you apply all of this stuff to that? And the variance was larger than the 18%. And so without race as a factor, we got a huge variance, which basically says there's a lot of variance because of socioeconomic status.
Well, I think we are just about out of time, Edward. Thank you so much for coming on, and I love listening to you talk about the density stuff. I know we've gone down into the weeds in this a few times in the past, but some great insights. I appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us on the MP Access podcast, sir.
My pleasure, David. Stay tuned, your audience, because we think great things are going to come this year, next year, and the following years. This problem can be solved of supply. It will take 10 years of change at the state level, which then has to filter down. But we know it can work. It worked in Houston, and it's worked in some other places. We know it can work, but we need to have these law changes in order to get the government out of the way.
Well, I know I will be talking to you more about this in coming months when we touch base again. But thank you so much for your time, Edward. We will talk again later. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the MP Access podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to MP Access. You can find the latest stories and new episodes of the podcast anytime at themortgagepoint.com. We'll see you next week.